Our next session is on science and hope. And we've got a scripture reading and a prayer. So if you brothers would go ahead and take that away.
So we're going to read Romans 15:13, NIV translation. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. And then we're going to read 1 Timothy 4:10, which is, that is why we labor and strive, because we have put our hope in living God, who is a Savior of all people, and especially of all those who believe.
Heavenly Father, we are grateful for a creation full of life, all activated by your breath. In the face of challenges, you empower us to hope. We know that you will care for us as you care for the sparrows. As we seek to better care for one another and for this planet, continue to guide us toward a more heavenly kingdom here on earth. In your name we pray. Amen.
This is a session that is very special because we'll be hearing from one of my heroes and a number of our heroes, Katharine Hayhoe. And so to lead us in that conversation, she's written an amazing book called Saving Us, a climate scientist's case for hope and healing in a divided world. And whoever raises their hand the first that would like a copy of this, now that's unfair advantage. A student, there you've got it. We are going to be allowing. We're doing most of the books online, so for you to sell, but we do have a book page for links to the books. But this is a very special, important book for this time. Our esteemed guests this morning are Ryan Hanning, and I've known Ryan for many years. He's with this. Well, I'll let you introduce yourself because you've been with the University of Mary and a variety of other Catholic institutions, I think the Institute for Catholic Theology, and then Jim Buizer, who is a remarkable person. He helped start the School of Sustainability, maybe did start the School of Sustainability here at ASU with Michael Crow, was one of the first people to come out with Michael as his science advisor. The School of Sustainability is kind of a big deal. It's now the School of Global Futures. And then he went to University of Arizona, another institution of higher learning down south. And our friends, we're going to work together to make Arizona a more sustainable, resilient place. And so he is the head of a number of institutes that they brought all together on one. They had 11 institutes related to resilience and environment and sustainability. And all that was merged together into one, and guess who they asked to head that up? That would be Jim Buizer.
Great, thank you, Ben. Well, good morning. As Ben said, I'm Ryan Hanning. It's a great pleasure to be here again at the conference on faith and science. And this morning we're going to really examine the virtue of hope and how that relates to science. Admittedly, I always feel a little bit out of my league. I'm not a subatomic particle physicist like Barry Ritchie. I'm not a astrophysicist like Paul Davies, who heard from last night. I don't even have a British accent. I'm just a theologian and homesteader, but most of my personal and professional career has been examining what it means to be in right relationship with the land. And from a theological perspective and from a scientific perspective, because we can measure that in many ways. And so today we're going to look at specifically the virtue of hope of my own background. Look at what does it mean to be in the right relationship with the land, and how does that relate to the other commandments, those that precede it, right? Which to be in right relationship with each other and right relationship ultimately with God. Right relationship with each other, the field of ethics. Right relationship with God, the field of theology, and practically in the field of worship. And so in a particular way, the Judeo-Christian understanding of stewardship and participation in the environment precedes this conversation we're going to have this morning about what it means to be a good steward. So I'm really excited to have with us both Jim Buizer, professor at U of A, and then also Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, who is with us from Texas Tech online. And before they both talk this morning, before we lead a dialogue, I want us to reflect a little bit on the particular virtue of hope, because it's unique among the virtues. We spoke last night about the virtues necessary to do science well, but like faith and love, hope is one of those theological virtues. We receive it by essentially being open to it. It's a gift from the Lord that we receive. And hope is so essential. In fact, St. Paul says we were saved by hope. Pope Benedict XVI says that hope is the key characteristic feature of the Christian, right? That we have this virtue infused in us that we can actually believe that God will bring something good even out of this mess. And so it's a particular way we're going to focus really on climate change and the science in regards to how we're good stewards of the environment. And we really have two people to guide us through that in a really remarkable way this morning. So Jim Buizer is Professor of Climate Adaptation and International Development at the School of Natural Resources and Environment at the U of A. And he's also good friends with Katharine Hayhoe, who will be our principal speaker this morning. So I'll turn it over to him to introduce Katharine, and we'll look forward to your questions and a good discussion afterwards.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I actually have, and I told Katharine this, I have 4 pages that I printed out from her website. I'm not going to read them all, but I am going to look at my paper because it's really kind of hard to keep track of all of the things that she is doing and the honors that she is being given because of the work that she's done. So I'm going to go through that. I know Katharine as a colleague and as a friend. So first, I'll just say that Katharine walks the talk. Even without COVID, I suspect that she would have done this remotely, as with about 90% of the requests that she gets, because of the travel is like for most of us that are in global sciences and climate, is our biggest carbon footprint. And so what she'll normally do is when asked, she'll try and find a local individual at the place, or she'll do it via Zoom or via video. So that's Katharine. I'm afraid, Katharine, I did drive my car up from Tucson, but the good news is, like you, I offset the carbon that I do emit. So thank you, Katharine, for being here. Katharine started with her bachelor's in science in physics and astronomy from the University of Toronto. So when you get this, you hear her non-Texan accent, you'll know why. And then she went on to get her master's and PhDs in atmospheric sciences with another colleague, Don Wobbles, who is, and it's through Don's work, Katharine, that I actually got to know you and your dissertation with Don. She has really made a mark. So, like I said earlier, as a climate scientist, I got to know Katharine as a scientist because she is a remarkable, highly acclaimed scientist. And when I learned that she was a Christian, I thought, oh, this is someone that I really want to get to know. So she's published over 125 peer-reviewed papers, abstracts, and other publications. She's been involved in the U.S. National Climate Assessments. That's probably where I originally got to meet you personally in the 3rd Climate Assessment. These are assessments of the state of knowledge around the climate, its impacts, and what are we going to do about it. They happen every 4 years, or they're supposed to happen every 4 years, and where hundreds of scientists come together and put their knowledge together on that. And the last time, in fact, I saw you, Katharine, I think it was in Washington at one of these. She's also chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy. She's a distinguished professor in political science, endowed chair in public policy and public law. Imagine that. She's an atmospheric scientist in the Department of Political Science at Texas Tech. She's associated with the public health program in the Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences there. She is principal investigator for a very important center called the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. She mostly focuses on what is establishing the scientific basis for assessing regional to local scale impacts of climate change on human systems and the natural environments. She and her husband, Andrew Farley, who's a pastor, wrote a book called Climate for Change, Global Warming Facts for Faith-Based Decisions. I didn't bring it with me, but I have a very dog-eared copy of that, Katharine. A tremendous book, so would highly recommend it. She did a TED Talk, and her TED Talk has close to 4 million views. Her newest book that you just showed, I have I'm going to show my copy, Ryan, just to show off. And she serves as advisor to quite a number of different organizations. I'm not going to list them all, but here's some of the cool stuff that I just learned about you, Katharine. She is, let's see, here it is. Okay. Was named one of Christianity Today's 50 Women to Watch in 2012, was awarded by the AGU, the American Geophysical Union Climate Communication Prize, and named in 2014 as one of Time's 100 most influential people. Not just one of the most influential women climate scientists, but one of the 100 most influential people. And Foreign Policies, 100 leading global thinkers. She, let's see, let me just skip past a number of these, was named to Political's 50 list of thinkers, doers, and visionaries transforming American politics. In 2017, she was named one of Fortune's world's greatest leaders, and one of Working Mother's 50 most influential moms. In 2018, she got the Stephen Schneider Award for Outstanding Climate Science Communication. Anyone that is in the climate world knows what that means, knows who Stephen Schneider was. And then in 2019, if it wasn't enough that back in 2017 they did this, Foreign Policy listed her again, one of the 100 global thinkers. And then she also made the Apolitical's list of the 100 most influential people in climate policy. And Elle Magazine, I had to look that up. I didn't know what Elle Magazine was. Elle Magazine's list of 27 women leading the change. Most importantly to me is that she's a colleague, a friend, and a fellow Christian. Katharine?
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be with you in this way and to be speaking about such an important topic. For the last 4 or 5 years, no matter where I go, no matter who I'm speaking to, it could be at a university, it could be a group of business people, it could be a community group, it could be a Christian college. No matter where I'm speaking, I get the same question, which is what gives you hope? So the topic of this session, science and hope, is one that I want to reflect on more generally and then focus a little bit more narrowly on specifically the topic of climate change, because that is one where we see an increase, a significant increase in what I call doomerism over the last year. In fact, I would go so far as to say that it is increasing exponentially among people who have decided that there is no hope, and people to whom hope is now a bad word. If you say hope, they will react with rage and anger that is fueled by their profound disappointment and pain, because they do not feel like there is anything that they can do that can make a difference in a world that increasingly to many seems to be headed in the wrong direction. So let me begin, though, by reflecting, first of all, on the topics of science and hope. When we look at the question of faith and science, and particularly the question of Christianity and science, most people make an assumption. Most people assume that the intersection between people who are top research scientists, actively engaged in their field, publishing, writing grants, doing research, and people who identify with a specific faith, that overlap is very small. In fact, I have even quite literally heard people use words like unicorn to describe that intersection. And often people ask me, are you the only person in there? And of course, the answer to that is obviously not. This conference is an example of how there are many of us in there. But that's why I think the work of Elaine Eklund is so interesting. And if you're not familiar with her work, she studies science, scientists, and religion. So a number of years ago, in her book that she published called Science versus Religion, What Scientists Really Think, she interviewed 1,700 natural and social scientists at top R1 universities across the U.S., and asked them about their views on religion, spirituality, and ethics. And to her own surprise, as well as the surprise of many other people, I would bet, she found that 50% of us identify with a specific religious label, in that we would say, I am a Christian, I am Jewish, I am Hindu, I am Buddhist, I am. Digging deeper, she found that 70% of us consider ourselves to be spiritual people. In other words, we believe that there is more than what we can quantify with science. And then, perhaps most interestingly, of the 30% who said they were atheist, 20% insisted to her, although this was not a category on the survey, they insisted to her that they were spiritual atheists. And so she had some very interesting conversations digging into what exactly they would consider that to be. But what we see here is that the overwhelming body of people who are scientists in this country view science not as being incompatible with spirituality, but as holding both of those together. So when you look at the intersection between research scientists and believers, people who would use a specific label to say I am, the intersection is actually 50%. And the intersection becomes even greater once she expanded her work to look at people who hold science-based careers. So people who have scientific training, and they might work in engineering or in health or in some such field like that, not directly in academia. This is no surprise, though, because when you look back, the National Academy of Sciences 23 years ago published a report on the topic of religion and science. And in it, they said scientists, like many others, are touched with awe at the order and complexity of nature. Indeed, many scientists are deeply religious, and that is absolutely correct. One book I read myself a long time ago was the book that Francis Collins wrote called The Language of God, and I imagine that's been deeply influential with many people. They went on to define the sort of separate magisteria approach, that they occupy two separate realms of human experience, and that demanding they be combined detracts from the glory of each. And what I want to argue here is that when it comes to thorny, difficult issues with moral and ethical implications to them, let alone implications reflecting directly on human life and the future of human civilization as we know it, I would argue that we need both of them. And I was just reading an interesting article yesterday that talked about the dearth of people who feel able to openly express religious affiliation in Silicon Valley. And the article was talking about, here we have the most powerful tech companies in the world, which, as we are soon realizing, tech carries enormous ethical and moral implications that quite frequently those companies have not thought through, like the role that Facebook plays in politically polarizing people, the role that YouTube played in actually disseminating and spreading the flat earth conspiracy theory, the fact that climate denial is rampant on many social media sites and there's nothing done to, about it in any way, shape, or form. So these big tech companies, this article was saying that I was just reading yesterday, many people who work there do not feel able to express the fact that they belong to a faith tradition because of cultural pressures within those organizations. And the article was arguing that, in fact, the very opposite is needed, because technology without a sense of ethics, values, or morals attached to it, we have already seen can move us very rapidly into extremely dangerous territory. So this 23 years ago, I think, was an incomplete conclusion. And using my own field of climate change as an example, I want to continue to explore that. But first, I just want to touch on what I alluded to before, which is that Elaine found that 76% of people in scientific professions identify with a specific religious label. So the whole perception that we are unicorns is completely false. In fact, most of us are part of this community where we believe that there is more to our existence, to this universe, than we can quantify with science alone. And really, okay, now, I didn't actually calculate the area of the overlap, but this is what we're talking about here, is a significant overlap between the two groups. So why do Americans still think that scientists are hostile to religion? What Elaine found was this. She found that within our faith communities, religious scientists often practice what she calls a secret science. Sitting in the pews, we are often hesitant, well, to be totally honest, my church doesn't have pews, sitting in whatever seating arrangement we have, we're often hesitant to discuss scientific ideas because we're afraid of offending those next to us. And so because of that, when we look at headlines these days of scientific issues like COVID, vaccines, climate change, and more, we see in the United States, and it really has reached a fever pitch here, although it certainly exists in other countries as well, like Canada, the US, the UK, and more, we see huge perceived conflicts between issues of science and issues of faith. And the scientists who are part of those communities are, as Elaine said, often self-silencing. because of the contentious nature of these debates. And this is happening in Catholic churches. A study by my colleague Dan DeLeo, who heads the Catholic Climate Covenant, found that most U.S. bishops are silent on the topic of climate change after the Pope's encyclical. A quarter of evangelical Christians reject the idea that climate is changing. COVID denial is something that is uniquely there in a lot of Christian churches. I would argue that now more than ever, we need our voices to be heard, because these things are not things that don't affect us today. It's not questions about the age of the universe or the origins of humans. It is questions about our immediate future, literally our health today, some people's potential long-term illness and even death because they do not heed scientific advice, and the future of human civilization as we know it. Because when it comes to climate change, we are truly conducting an unprecedented experiment with the only planet we have. That is what climate change is. As far back as we can go in the history of the planet, we have never seen this much carbon going into the atmosphere this quickly. Never. And why do we care about it? We care about it because it is quite literally affecting the water that we drink, and we can't survive without clean water. It's affecting the air that we breathe, and we cannot survive without clean air. Did you know that burning fossil fuels produces so much air pollution? I'm not even talking about the heat-trapping gases that are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, causing it to warm. I'm just talking about the short-lived air pollutants. Burning fossil fuels produces so much short-term air pollution that it is responsible for over 9 million premature deaths every single year. That is double the number of COVID deaths, and it happens every single year. This truly is an issue that has profound implications for our health. Climate change is affecting the food we eat, the quantity and the quality, the nutritional content of the food, especially in some of the poorest parts of the world. We live in a society, in a civilization where our roads and buildings, our water systems and our electricity systems, all the infrastructure we have is built for a planet that no longer exists. Climate is changing faster than any time in the history of human civilization on this planet. And that's why it matters, because it affects us. Most visibly, climate change is loading the weather dice against us. It is taking naturally occurring events that have always happened, like droughts, heat waves, wildfires, hurricanes, floods, and it's supersizing them, making them worse. Our droughts are stronger and longer. Our heat waves are more intense. Our wildfires are burning greater area. Our hurricanes are dumping more rain. Wherever we live in the world, it's as if we have two weather dice, and we always have a chance of naturally rolling a double six. But as the world warms decade by decade, it's sneaking in and taking one of these numbers and then another and turning them into sixes and taking another and turning into a 7. And all of a sudden people are saying, it was 118 degrees Fahrenheit in Portland, Oregon. How could that be? And you might laugh about that in Arizona, but believe me, if you're in Portland, you are not prepared for that. You might say, in California, they're breaking record after record after record for the largest area ever burned by a wildfire. How could that be? In Houston, Texas, there's 3 500-year flood events in 3 years. How could that be? Climate change is loading the dice against us, and it is hitting us right in the wallet, right in the pocketbook, and it is endangering human well-being and human life. So when I look around the world, I see these headlines everywhere. Glaciers melting faster, sea level rising faster, billions of dollars of impacts, costs are underestimated. We've been underestimating the pace of climate change. Why? It's simply because it's truly unprecedented. We're doing the best we can. And we're pretty good at estimating global temperature change. But what we're not good at is estimating how that affects us. We have significantly underestimated the risks and the impacts of these changes because we've never seen them before. Not in the history of human civilization have we seen change happening this fast. When we look, again, at the pictures of these devastation, at billions of dollars in flood losses, at climate change loading the dice against us, making heat waves more frequent, at the prime minister of an entire country that was completely destroyed. All of their housing was destroyed by supersized hurricanes. He said, to deny climate change is to deny a truth that we have just lived. Climate change is no longer an environmental issue. It's no longer a future issue. It's now a human issue, and it's a present issue. So we need the science when it comes to issues like this. Why? Well, first of all, we need the science to tell us how we're affecting our world. We need the science to tell us why it matters, how it's affecting, again, our water, our food, our air, our infrastructure, our economy, our health. We need the science, and this is what I actually do as a scientist, to tell us if we make this decision, what will happen. If we continue to rely on fossil fuels, what will happen? Eventually, it will mean the end of civilization as we know it. We will not be able to cope with these disasters. Our economic systems, our supply chains, our water distribution systems, our infrastructure, even our geopolitical systems will not be able to cope with the stresses. But if we reduce our emissions, if we transition to clean energy, if we reduce our food waste and our energy waste, which alone could cut our carbon emissions in half just through reducing waste alone, then what would our future look like? It would be survivable. We would have to adapt significantly, but we would still have water coming out of the tap. We would still have an economy and roads and bridges and, the ability to travel and have a job and have a safe place to live. And that's worth fighting for, I think. And that's what science tells us is on the line. So where do we need our faith? Where does our faith come in? I think of it like this way, and this is not my own analogy. I freely admit that I have stolen it from many other people. But plagiarism is the biggest form of flattery, is it not? We can think of science like a map. Science tells us there's a mountain over here and a lake over here, and that way's north and south. But how do we know where to go on the map? We need directions. Our values give us directions on where we want to go. And for many of us, in fact, the vast majority of us, not only in the United States and not only around the world, but even in the scientific community, the vast majority of us, our values come from our faith. What are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to respond to this issue? That's why we need this, because it is quite literally not about saving the planet. That's why I didn't call my book Saving the Planet. The planet will be orbiting the sun long after we are gone. It truly is about saving us humans, and many of the other living things that share this planet with us. That Genesis 1 tells us we are to have responsibility over, a God-given responsibility. And in fact, that is the reason Genesis gives for why we were created in God's image, is to have that responsibility over every living thing on this planet. So when I began, I mentioned that the most frequent question I'm asked is this one: what gives you hope? So this is what I want to start to explore. And then after this, we're going to go into a discussion where we unpack this a little more. And then we're going to take a few questions from you as well. But I want to offer a few thoughts here on what does give us hope and what does not give us hope. And I want to begin with what does not. Too often I find people are looking for hope in the wrong places. And one of the places that people look for hope, I'm sorry to say, is in politics. People pin their hope on a candidate, on a policy, on a piece of legislation, and then are bitterly disappointed when it does not come to fruition. And we're seeing this right now in this country. Why is politics not a source of hope? Well, first of all, you can't pin your hopes on a single human person or a single human policy, because it's never going to fulfill all of your desires, hopes, dreams, and wishes. But today, our politics is even more difficult to get anything done. Why? Because over time, we have become more and more polarized. So 26, 27 years ago, this is what the political landscape in the United States looked like. The median Democrat was closer to the median Republican than they were to the tails of their own party. What has happened over time? People have moved further and further apart. And in fact, for the 2017 election, if you only looked at people who voted in the election, this is what it looked like. So what happens? Thorny issues like COVID response and climate change fall right into the chasm between these two parties. And in fact, according to the Pew Foundation, political polarization in the United States, and if you look at the date, this was 8 years ago, and it's a lot worse now than it was 8 years ago. Political polarization has reached a new high. It is higher than any time since the Civil War. And the United States is exceptional in terms of its political divide across the entire world. Although unfortunately, in many other parts of the world, including Canada, Australia, the UK, and more, those countries are also becoming more and more polarized, more and more divided, which means there's less and less chance to come together over what we share and greater chance to focus on what divides us. A report came out that I quote in the beginning of my book because I thought this conclusion was so profound. It came out a year ago last summer. They said, increasingly Americans who identify as either Democrat or Republican, both, not either or, view one another less as fellow citizens and more as enemies who represent a profound threat to our identities. When this mindset develops, compromise with the other side is viewed as weakness or betrayal, and their gain is seen as our loss. How does this relate to scientific issues? Well, before COVID, in January 2020, this was a list of the most politically polarized topics in the United States. And the width of the gray bar is how far apart Republicans and Democrats are, and the wider the gray bar, the more polarized the issue. Well, what do we have right at the top of this list? We have climate change and environmental protection, the very issues that Christians have a sound theological basis to speak out on, both for having responsibility over every living thing on this planet, and we're told by Jesus that we're to be known by our love for others, and it is always the poorest and most marginalized and most disadvantaged who are most impacted by a changing climate, by lack of environmental protection, as well as by guns and military, immigration, education, healthcare costs, race, and more. So how did this change with COVID? Well, they redid the survey a year later, and here's what it looked like. The width of the gray bars, again, is how polarized people are, and the wider the gray bar, the more polarized there are. What do we have at the top? We have addressing issues around race, dealing with climate change, and dealing with COVID outbreak. Then we've also got dealing with problems of poor people, reducing healthcare costs. All the issues that relate to loving and caring for each other are right there at the top. We need our faith more than ever today to tackle these issues that divide us profoundly. So what's the connection? People often come up with, and we were just speaking before we started the session about the religiously sounding objections that people have to climate change. You know, God's in control, so how could this happen? Or the world's going to end anyway, so why does it matter? And they're so popular, in fact, to have a little global weirding episode called What Does the Bible Say About Climate Change on YouTube that addresses these because they really have no theological basis at all. And I think I wanted to use this quote from Gail and Carey because I think it sums it up so perfectly. And you could take evangelical, and to be totally honest, you can also put Catholic in there too. You can put Protestant in there as well. Many Christians oppose actions to slow climate change not on a religious basis, but politically because they believe the government wants to take away their freedom. This is Exhibit A. I'm going to give you Exhibit B as well. Jim Inhofe, senator for Oklahoma for many years, well known for rejecting the science of climate change and for using religiously sounding arguments to do so. God is still up there. The arrogance of people to think that we humans would be able to change what he is doing in the climate is, to me, outrageous. Where did he form this opinion? Did he find it in the Bible? Did he hear it in church? The same year he said this, he was very honest, and he actually told someone where he found this opinion. Here it is. The same year, he said, when he was being interviewed on TV, he said, do you realize, he was being interviewed by, I think, Rachel Maddow. He said, do you realize I was actually on your side of this issue when I first chaired the Senate Environment Committee and I heard about this? I was on your side till what? Till I read something in the Bible or heard something in church? No, I was on your side until I found out how much it would cost to fix it. And when he says how much it would cost, he does not mean the total cost, because study after study after study shows that it's a lot cheaper to fix it now than it is to deal with the outcome later. But he was referring specifically to the cost of the fossil fuel industry, which supports a lot of the politicians in Oklahoma and Texas, where I live. So that's what does not give us hope. And the more we follow politics, the less hope we have, I feel like. And so I actually make deliberate choices not to engage or follow a lot of that dialogue. But instead, I focus deliberately. And I believe the Bible tells us to do this, right? You know, in Philippians, it talks about whatever is good, whatever is right, to dwell on these things. And so when I go out to look for hope, I don't look for sort of a Pollyanna hope where, oh, everything will be okay if we just wish it to be, or if I just sort of bury my head in the sand like the mythical ostrich, it'll be okay. I look for the real hope that begins with recognizing the risk and understanding that it's bad. We are in a very bad situation. There is suffering already happening. Success here on this earth is not inevitable or even entirely probable, But there is a better future possible here. And there is a path to get there. That's what I believe real hope is. And we see this frame echoed in the Bible. Jeremiah, a prophet, speaking to people who were suffering. I know the plans I have for you. They are plans for good and not for evil, to give you what? A future and a hope. Hope is the idea that there is a future. That is what hope is. Hope is the idea that if we strive in that dark place of suffering for something better, there is the possibility of a better outcome here on this earth. And the science has some of that hope. If we look at how much the world has warmed and how much carbon we have produced, the bottom axis is not time, it's how much carbon we have produced. We see that how much more the world warms, those colored squares, depends on the choices we make. What is the difference between those colored sort of triangles? How much fossil fuels we burn, and how much we deforest our land, and how much industrial agriculture we continue to invest in. So our choices determine which of those boxes we end up in. And I love this conclusion of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You know, after issuing yet another doorstop of doom, so to speak, a hundreds of page report on just how bad it is and how much worse it's going to get, this was the way they concluded. And is this not hopeful? Every action matters. Every bit of warming matters. Every year matters. And every choice matters. We have agency. And as one of my colleagues said, who put together a wonderful book of women's voices on climate change, she said, "It is a magnificent time to be alive at a moment that matters so much." But in this moment that matters so much, it turns out that 70% of people are worried about climate change. 70% of Americans are already worried about climate change. 50% feel hopeless and don't know where to start, and only 8% are activated. And how does this relate to hope? It relates directly to hope. Because our sense of hope is tied to our sense of efficacy. If I do something, will it make a difference? And if I don't think it will make a difference, I don't do anything, I despair, and I fall into the doomerism that I talked about before. Fear paralyzes us. And if we don't know what to do, we don't have any hope that our actions could make a difference. Too often we see climate action, for example, as a giant boulder sitting at the bottom of an impossibly steep cliff with only a few hands on it trying to push it up, and it isn't budging even an inch. And if I add my hand, it won't move. But when we realize that that boulder is in fact already at the top of the hill, and it is already rolling down the hill in the right direction, and it already has millions of hands on it, and if I add mine, it will go a little bit faster, then we realize that we truly could make a difference. And many of the people who have their hands on this boulder realize this. So, there's many young people who are very active in speaking out about this. And Greta Thunberg is perhaps the most well-known of these. And something she said is very powerful. She said, the one thing we need more than hope right now is action. But once we start to act, hope is all around us. So where do we start, people often say? We start with the one thing that we're not doing. And this is why I wrote my book about hope and about what we can do. Because the number one thing that we can do is something so simple, we often skip right over it. To stop self-silencing and to speak out. To speak out about why this matters and about what solutions look like. It knocks over the first domino in that row of change. And as I alluded to, we are not doing it. When it comes to science, in religion, we're not speaking out. And when it comes to climate change, none of us are speaking out. The vast majority of us all across the country agree that global warming is happening. Anywhere that's orange is more than 50%. The darker orange, the more people say yes. But when we're asked, do we think it matters? Most of us say, probably not. And when we're asked, do we ever talk about it? Most of us say, no, we don't. And if we don't talk about it, why would we care? And if we don't care, why would we ever want to do anything about it? So talking about why it matters, how it's affecting us, and what we can do to fix it is one of the most important things that we can do. Talk about what's happening and how climate change is not only an environmental issue. It affects our infrastructure, our economy, our energy. It affects our water, our natural resources, our health. It affects our food, our biodiversity, our conservation, and our justice and equity most of all. When we look at who is most affected by climate change, it has already increased the gap between the richest and poorest countries in the world by as much as 25%. Climate change threatens to undo the last 50 years of development, global health, and poverty reduction. Climate change matters profoundly to us, and there are many things that we can do to address it. But at its core is a simple concept. And in the words of another one of the young people who is speaking out so boldly on this issue, a Ugandan climate activist named Vanessa Nakate, she says, climate change is more than science. It's more than statistics. It's more than data points. It is about the people who are being impacted right now. And so when I think of climate action, when I think of hope, it all comes down to a simple word, which is where the Bible takes us when we look at suffering and a path to hope. And here's what the Bible says. It says this. In Romans, the Apostle Paul is writing to the Romans, and he says, we know that suffering, he begins with suffering. We know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character produces hope. And why does the hope not put us to shame? Because God's love has been poured out in our hearts. What is a lack of action on these important, thorny, difficult issues that science can tell us about, but that have tremendous implications for people's health, well-being, and future? What is lack of action rather than a lack of love? A failure to love those who we're called to care for. A failure to take responsibility over this amazing planet that God has entrusted to us. And so that is why I truly believe our faith is at the center of our response to this issue. And if we take our faith seriously, we will be out at the front of many lines demanding forward action. Why? In the name of love. Thank you.
Katharine, thank you so much. What I love about that presentation is that you draw to the surface that in a particular way, the Judeo-Christian sort of tradition places stewardship and participation in creation. It really sort of runs through the narrative of both the Old and New Testament. Right? The fact that we're made in God's image and likeness to guard and till the soil makes actual faith imperative to be in right relationship with the land, and that precedes and is related to being in right relationship with each other, specifically the poor and those around us, but also in right relationship with God. So this idea that Christianity and our faith has something to contribute specifically in this time of crisis, this urgent time, is why I'm so interested in this particular topic, both as a theologian and as a husband and father that want to give a world slightly better to my own children. So I'm curious, as you talk, and I want to ask you and Jim to reflect on this. The ancient Greeks say there's only one thing more contagious than fear, and it's hope. And so I see in this time of a lot of fear and a lot of doom and gloom, and I understand the urgency. What particularly, how does hope, the virtue of hope, make you better scientists? How does it inform the way that you actually approach the study of the climate? So Jim, I'll turn it over to you first.
Sure. Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, really good question. You mentioned, or actually Ben mentioned, the institute that I'm running, and it's we call it the Arizona Institutes for Resilience. It is completely focused on solutions towards making a more resilient environment, society, economy writ large. And the solution side of things is what gives us hope. Because as Katharine certainly said nicely in your book, but it's not just technology, but technologies. If I were to look at how we organize, and it was my charge to define and organize, lay out a vision, set out projects. The projects that we actually, the way we've dedicated our research to the solutions is to fill knowledge gaps. So what is the problem that we're trying to solve, and work backwards and fill knowledge gaps, and create our coursework and our classes to also educate towards the resilience side. Resilience, by definition, as a goal, if we didn't have that as a goal, and if there wasn't hope, then that would be a fairly useless endeavor.
Katharine, how about you? How does the virtue of hope inform the way you approach science?
Well, that virtue informs the specific type of research I do. So as I mentioned, I look at the difference between the futures that our choices will determine. And I actually quantify hope. If we do this, here is what will happen. If we don't do this, here is what will happen. And so that provides both a warning, almost in the spirit of the Old Testament prophets, of if we continue on our current pathway, what the impacts will be. But it also offers a potentially different future, one that can be determined by the choices that we make today. And that, I believe, truly is the concept of hope, that there is something better available for us if we make that choice and we fight as hard as we can towards it. Because if there isn't a better future possible, why not eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die? That's a very human response to a lack of hope. But instead, we are told that, and one of my other favorite verses I didn't mention, which I love because it reflects directly to what you said about hope and fear both being contagious. The verse where Paul's writing to Timothy and he says, God has not given us a spirit of fear. So if we experience fear, if we're acting out of fear, which often paralyzes us or causes us to attack others, that fear does not come from God. Instead, what God has given us is a spirit of power, which is sort of an old-fashioned way of saying that we are empowered, we have agency, or we have efficacy. We can act rather than being paralyzed. We have been given a spirit of love to care for others and act on their behalf. And as a scientist, my favorite part, a sound mind to make good decisions based on the information that God has given us, some of it through science.
I love it. So you quantify hope. I'm going to use that when I introduce you in the future. So Katharine Hayhoe, climate scientist, she quantifies hope. I like that.
I'm going to add that to my bio. Thank
I
you.
think that's really good. I like that, and we need that now. I think more than ever. It's interesting. So my background in theology, a lot of times I'll teach dogmatics or systematics, and one of the interesting things about the human heart, the way that we're made, right? We have our faith, our will, our intellect, our will, and then our appetite or our passions. And faith comes to properly perfect and elevate our intellect. Love comes to properly direct our passions, but it's hope that's directed to our will, right? It actually perfects and elevates our will, Aristotle would say. And so this idea of hope being connected to action, I think, is so key, right? And we wouldn't act unless we had hope of a better future. So I'm really curious, in the latter part of your book, and I think one of the geniuses, both in the focus on the dialogue, but also then in providing some reasons for hope, you walk through some of the emerging technologies that science actually does, and you just alluded to it too. These opportunities that we can be afforded to use our intellect and our will to actually change the course of some of the effects of our bad stewardship. So could you just reflect for a moment, what are some of the particular areas of science that give you hope that we can actually start to sort of change course in regards to how we interact with the land? So Jim, I'll turn to you. What are some of those emerging technologies that you're most excited about?
Well, there. As I think you've mentioned, Katharine, in the past, that John Holdren said that there are three things that we can mitigate or reduce greenhouse gases and mitigate. We can adapt and suffer, and our decisions will determine which fraction of those we will actually experience. And the particularly around technologies, because if looking back at what, Katharine, you were showing, the polarization, you're right. I've certainly lost hope, and that's changed in my lifetime. I've seen it dramatically. My parents, I grew up in Chile. My parents were missionaries in Chile, and I've felt from the very beginning that my conversation was, and my mission as a scientist was essentially to be a missionary, produce good science, associate with people like you, Katharine, who do good science, and then communicate that so that we could then convince enough people with change. You can't pile data onto someone that is more data onto someone that is already convinced. And you pointed this out, not because of anything other than their sort of political affiliation. They've decided that because I am X, I must believe in the following or accept certain truths. So to me, everything from the solar technology to new battery technology, and more recently, right here at ASU, Klaus Lochner has come up with carbon capture. It isn't enough, I believe, to just stop producing more greenhouse gases. We've already done so much damage, we've got to start pulling it back out. So I think through technologies, in particular through technology. And the one other thing that I'm hopeful, I love working at a university. Every single year where there's a new crop of 18-year-olds with hope. They start out with hope. They start out with, what is it that I'm going to be, and what do I want to believe in, and what is going to be my passion? And I found that every single year that I see, and in fact, Michael Crow does this every year, where he lets all the faculty know. Barry, you know this. He lets all the faculty know. By the way, the people that are coming in as freshmen have never lived in a world without Facebook. People come in, and so he goes through this whole list to remind the rest of us.
And Katharine, before you answer your question, I'm going to augment it slightly. So not only the new technologies that you're excited about that might help us mitigate some of the harm that we've done by being bad stewards, specifically to, not only the technology, but a lot of times this is really a behavior issue, right? Even if we adapt new technologies and we don't change ourselves, we're likely going to fall into the same situation, right? So it's really about conversion and aligning our will with even living in accord with our nature. So maybe you can talk about some of the new technologies and some of the things you think are necessary to really have that dialogue, like you said, not just to dump data, but to really convince people to change behavior in the way they're living. So maybe you can talk about both new technologies and some of the things that we can do practically in how we behave to make an impact on climate change.
Yes. So one of the biggest reasons, in fact, I would say the biggest reason people reject climate science and climate action is not because they truly have a problem with 200 years of physics. I mean, it's the same physics that explains how stoves heat food and how airplanes fly. And there's not a lot of people out there. I mean, on the internet, I know you can find anything, but there's not a lot of people who say that stoves actually don't work. So why do people reject it? It's because of solution aversion. If we don't think there's any solutions to the problem that are consistent or compatible with our values, if we view the only solutions as a direct threat to our well-being or our ideology or our identity, then what we do is we go out, and it's a process called motivated reasoning. We go out and we find excuses to say it's not real. Because if I say it is real and it affects the poorest and most vulnerable people, but I don't care about it and I don't want to fix it, that would make me a bad person. And most of us do not want to be a bad person. And so instead we go out and we look for these sciencey sounding excuses. But what happens is when we realize there are solutions that work, that are consistent and compatible with our values or ideology or identity, then it totally flips our perspective on the issue. Whether it's a farmer who puts wind turbines on their land, whether it's, my favorite story in the book is probably John's dad. Whether it's John's dad, and I won't tell you the whole story because it's a great story though, who put solar panels on his roof simply to save money and be more independent and more frugal. We see again and again that when people realize they can be part of the solution, their objections to the problem evaporate. And so that's why when we have these conversations talking about why it matters and what we can do to fix it, not talking about the ice sheets and the polar bears and the sea level rise, those are the two things that really bring people on board and really bring people together. So when we talk about technology, our minds often jump to, solar farms or wind turbines. And we have a lot of those in Texas, where I live, in Arizona. I mean, Texas, last fall, we got a third of our energy from wind energy alone. But there's a lot more out there that people can get really excited about. So just simple solutions in your own home, like in my TED Talk, I talk about how for a long time, I just wanted a switch by the front door. And as you walk out the door, you flip that switch and it turns everything off in your house except for the fridge and maybe like your DVR or something. We waste so much energy that through energy efficiency alone, we could cut our carbon emissions in half. So talk about changes in the way we view things. We are so wasteful, and we're wasting money as well, not just resources. So just being more efficient will make a difference. And I'm super excited because next year we're finally getting a system, and it's not a switch by the front door. It's on your phone where you push the away button when you leave the house. I'm so excited about that. And I'm going to be really excited about telling people about that. And most people won't think that's a bad thing. They'll think it's a good thing. We're so wasteful with our food. We actually end up throwing out about half the food we produce, where it decays and produces heat-trapping gas emissions when people go hungry in our own cities. So thinking about waste is huge. Thinking also about investing in nature, because nature loves carbon. Carbon in the soil and carbon in ecosystems is a good thing. We just have too much in the atmosphere. So when we look at not just tree planting, but restoring lands, conserving wetlands, and smart farming, where, for example, you grow a cover crop, it takes up carbon from the atmosphere, you plow it back into the soil, all that carbon goes into the soil, where it is like Miracle Grow on steroids, one ag professor told me. There's all kinds of amazing solutions that can make farmers and ranchers part of the solution. Solutions that can help people save money rather than spend it. Solutions that can make our lives better today as well as in the future. Solutions like greening low-income neighborhoods that have been historically redlined. In Phoenix, one of my colleagues, Patricia Solis at ASU, she studies heat-related illness and death. And she found that during heat waves, lower income neighborhoods in Phoenix disproportionately suffer from this because they can't pay the AC bill. They're already exposed to poor air quality that harms their lungs. And she found this one block of dark red in her data, dark red meaning off the charts heat-related illnesses and deaths. And she was like, I wonder why there's that one red block. Like maybe it's an error in the data. And so she was sort of puzzling over this in her mind as she was driving to campus one day. And she had, because she's a geographer, she said she had her Google Maps up because she always loves looking at maps. So she was driving in, and as she was driving, she realized that red block is entirely mobile homes. Low-income people who do not have the ability to insulate their homes. They might have broken windows. They can't pay their AC bill. And they're surrounded by concrete, so they can't plant trees. So she's involved now with others and with the city to help to green those low-income areas such that when the heat waves come, people will be able to better survive them. And it improves air quality, it improves people's mental health, it improves their physical health, it provides more flood control when it rains. There's so many win-win-win solutions we can get excited about, and they help with climate change too. Those are the things we need to be doing today.
Thank you so much. And while we get some questions from people on Whova, one of the things I'm so impressed as you talk, and my experience with Jim as well, is that Jim, you provide us amazing data that can convince people, I think. But more than that, you can give a compelling narrative based off this hope that actually, if we live a little differently, if we take up seriously our call to be a good steward, that we can actually make this amazing impact. I just wrote an article for Hearth and Field, as a Christian agrarian journal, and I talk about how my sort of whole vision of conservancy comes from my grandparents, right? Shut the door, you don't live in a barn, turn off the light, you're not using it, and finish all your food. And it ends up those three things can actually make a much more dramatic impact than me driving a Tesla. Though if anyone wants to give me a Tesla, I'll be happy to receive one. But, right, so I mean, this reality that we move into this. So I think fear can get people to bury their head, fear can get people to run, but it really is hope and this truth that we can do something about it, and that God has given us an ability to actually interact with our planet in such a way that we can actually exercise our dominion and guard and till exactly how we're called to in the scriptures. So in your book, you dedicate it to everyone who believes that difficult issues in life are worth talking about. And we've been talking just about climate change, but any number of these contentious political or scientific issues can really be remedied. I mean, in some ways, I think in your book, Katharine, you can just take out anywhere where it says, global warming or climate crisis, and you put any sort of particular challenge, and it would still be a guide, because the reality is we need to talk about it. And I think not talking about it leads to these sort of existential challenges that we have. So real quick, as questions come in with our remaining 1 minute, what do you think, Jim, is the most important thing for students, particularly who are in the sciences, as they enter in? What do they need to do to really guard their hope?
So what do they need to do to guard their hope? I think understand that there are some really smart people like Katharine working on this problem, and that they've taken it as both a personal and a professional challenge, particularly when it comes to climate change. And that they too can be part of the solution and ought to start now. The one thing that I often tell my students is that each one of us needs to take a personal responsibility, even if it's just to not use single-use plastic straws. Just as one example, that's one thing we can do, and we can do that very well. How impactful is that? Well, we do that a few 100 million times over, and it's impactful. But the other impactful thing that we can do is vote. And vote for people who has the same values that we have with respect to the future of this planet. And that is a right and a privilege that we have in this country, and we should all use that. And that then gets them thinking about an actual personal step that they can take and be proud of taking.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. Well, our time is up. I'm going to give a plug real quick for, are we good to take a question? Okay, excellent. So I apologize, I was having an issue with the Who app, but we do have a question coming in that I think is a very, very important one. And Katharine, I'm going to direct it to you. So one of our participants is reading Steve Koonen's book, Unsettled, questioning to sort of whether or not the issues of climate change and its trajectory are indeed settled. And of course, Steve Koonen was the top Obama administration scientist on climate change. So this individual...
Correction, he was not.
Oh, he was not. Okay. So
no. Presents himself as that sometimes, but no. First thing to do with critical thinking is always look at who somebody actually was. He was in the Obama administration, DOE, not the top scientist on climate change.
Oh, well, that might answer the question, because the question is, what do you think of the book? And then also, really sort of, what's your advice? So this individual is a bioengineer, and he finds that the science of climate change very complex. So what is your take on that book and your advice to how we should think about whether or not this question is indeed settled or unsettled?
So here's the thing. Steve Koonen is a classic example of how, because of his ideology and his solution aversion, he has decided that he has to object to the science. And so he digs up the same old arguments that people have been using for 100 years, which are amply debunked online. And I recommend Skeptical Science and Climate Feedback as two great sources, because the science is actually not complicated. It's very clear. We've known since the 1800s that digging up and burning coal back then, and then oil and gas, of course, today, produces heat-trapping gases that are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, causing it to warm. We have literally known that since the 1850s. Since the 1890s, we have known exactly how much the world would warm if we doubled or tripled levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Scientists were worried enough about the impacts on humans and human civilization to formally warn a US president of the need for action in 1965. In the 1990s, Democrats and Republicans thought the same things about climate change. Climate denial didn't exist in the 1990s. Why did it come the last 20 years? Not because people actually question the science. It's because they don't want to fix it. And they know that if they say it isn't a real problem, then we don't have to fix it. So that is the proliferation of YouTube videos, books, and more purporting to say that this can't be real. But when you look into it, it is very simple. So Skeptical Science, Climate Feedback, my own Global Weirding series on YouTube presents it very clearly and very simply. To be totally honest, the only degree you need to understand the science is a kindergarten degree in terms of what we need to know to act. Of course, the Earth is complex. It's as complex as the human body. Of course, there's always more to discover in climate science. That's why I'm a climate scientist. But to know that climate is changing, humans are responsible, the impacts are serious, and the time to act is now. We have already known that for a very long time. And any efforts to confuse the science and complicate it are exactly that. Efforts to delay action in the name of political ideology and nothing else. So where do we find hope? We find it when we go out and we look for it. Hope does not find you. We find it when we go out in love, looking for ways that we can help others. So if you don't mind, I want to close with an example of a really interesting website that I helped develop that just got put online the other day. It's a website by Netflix. I bet you didn't think I was going to say that. By Netflix, to accompany the Don't Look Up movie about a comet that's going to destroy Earth. I helped develop an action website for people who want to take action. Are you ready to stop freaking out and start doing something? Here are some of the most powerful actions each one of us can take. It begins with talking about it. There's joining a climate group, and there's a lot of Christian climate groups. Catholic Climate Covenant, Evangelical Environmental Network, Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. Make your money count, keep politicians accountable, spark ideas at school and at work, push for climate headlines, and yes, take individual action, but when we do, talk about it. Because together, I truly believe that we can change the world.
Katharine, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time with us. And Jim, thank you as well.